Something unusual is developing around the Detroit Lions, and it starts with a question that many fans probably did not expect to be asking at this stage of the team's evolution. After everything this franchise has accomplished under Dan Campbell, after building one of the most talented rosters in the NFL, should the Lions still be pushing training camp with the same intensity that helped transform the culture years ago? That discussion gained attention after Dan Campbell made it clear that the Lions are not planning to back away from their identity. When asked about the intensity of training camp, his message was simple: the team is going to push. They are going to work hard. They are going to prepare for the season the way they always have, while trying to do it intelligently. For many Detroit fans, that mentality is exactly what built this team. When Campbell first arrived, the Lions were trying to escape years of disappointment. The franchise needed toughness. It needed accountability. It needed players who believed they could compete with anybody. The aggressive, physical approach became a major part of changing the culture. It helped erase the feeling that Detroit would somehow find a way to lose games even when holding a lead. It helped create a new standard, but now the conversation is different. The Lions are no longer trying to prove they belong. They already have one of the most talented rosters in football. Across multiple positions, Detroit has players who can legitimately be discussed among the best in the league. The roster is loaded with elite talent, and that reality changes the debate. The concern is no longer whether the team is tough enough. The concern is whether the team can stay healthy enough. That is where the discussion becomes fascinating. If you have stars entering their prime years, do you really need to keep pushing the same way? Or is there a point where preserving the roster becomes just as important as building it? The argument from one side is clear. Football is a physical game. Players need to be ready for contact. They need conditioning. They need strength. They need their bodies prepared for a long season. Campbell has always believed in creating that edge before week 1 arrives. The counter-argument is just as compelling. Every extra collision, every additional physical practice, every demanding session creates wear and tear. The NFL season is already brutal. If players are exhausted or dealing with accumulated injuries by the middle of the season, the benefits of those intense practices become harder to measure. And recent history only adds fuel to that conversation. The Lions have dealt with significant injury problems. The discussion in Detroit is no longer hypothetical because fans have watched key contributors miss time. Injuries have affected the team repeatedly, creating frustration as talented rosters were forced to navigate difficult stretches without important players available. That is why names like Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph immediately get attention whenever health becomes part of the conversation. Fans understand how important those players are to the defense. They also know that Aleem McNeil is working his way back after an ACL injury. Every discussion about physical practices naturally circles back to the same question: how much risk is too much risk? Another layer of this story involves the defensive identity itself. Detroit has built a reputation around aggressive physical football. The defense plays with intensity. It challenges receivers. It embraces contact. It demands effort on every snap. Fans love that style because it reflects the mentality Campbell brought to the organization. However, there is also a price attached to that approach. Playing that kind of defense week after week can be physically draining. Maintaining that level of intensity throughout an entire season is incredibly difficult. It requires not only talent, but also durability. The Lions have the talent. The challenge is making sure they have the durability when the most important games arrive. At the same time, there are reasons for optimism. One detail that sometimes gets overlooked is the presence of veteran safety Chuck Clark. While much of the attention remains focused on the stars, having an experienced player available provides valuable depth. Veteran leadership and stability can become extremely important during stretches when injuries test a roster. The Lions have also quietly become younger in several areas. As the roster continues evolving, Detroit is moving through another stage of the Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell era. Players who were once central pieces are no longer part of the team's future plans. Veterans such as Taylor Decker, Alex Anzalone, and Khalif Raymond represented important chapters in the team's rise, but the roster is continuing to change. The fascinating part is that many of Detroit's biggest stars are now entering what should be the prime years of their careers. The Lions have managed to assemble a core that includes Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, Sam Laporta, Penei Sewell, Jared Goff, Aiden Hutchinson, and Jack Campbell. Building that kind of foundation is difficult in the NFL. Keeping that foundation healthy may be even harder. And that brings us back to the central question facing Detroit this offseason. Dan Campbell's philosophy helped build a contender. Nobody can argue with the results. But as expectations rise and the championship window remains open, should the Lions continue pushing with the same physical edge that got them here? Or is it time to become more cautious in order to protect one of the league's most talented rosters? What do you think, Lions fans? Should Dan Campbell keep training camp as intense as ever? Or should Detroit prioritize staying healthy above everything else? The reason this conversation matters so much right now is because the Lions are entering a period that every NFL franchise dreams about, but very few actually reach. Detroit is no longer rebuilding. Detroit is no longer trying to surprise people. The Lions are expected to compete at the highest level, and when expectations change, the way you evaluate every decision changes as well. A few years ago, the conversation was simple: build toughness, build culture, build belief. Now the conversation is about maximizing a championship window. That window exists because Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell successfully stacked talent through multiple draft classes. The Lions have managed to get several cornerstone players developing together at the same time. That doesn't happen often in the NFL. Usually, by the time one group reaches its prime, another group is aging out. Detroit has somehow aligned those timelines, and that's why so many people believe the next several seasons represent the best opportunity this franchise has had in decades. When you look across the roster, it's easy to understand the excitement. Jared Goff remains in the middle of his prime and continues to provide stability at quarterback. Amon-Ra St. Brown has established himself as one of the most reliable playmakers in football. Jahmyr Gibbs continues to be a game-changing weapon every time he touches the ball. Sam Laporta has already become one of the league's most dangerous tight ends. Penei Sewell remains one of the premier offensive linemen in the NFL, while Aiden Hutchinson continues to lead the defensive side as one of the most important players on the entire roster. This is exactly why health has become such a massive topic among fans. Nobody questions the talent. Nobody questions the coaching staff's ability to motivate players. Nobody questions whether this team has enough determination. The concern is whether the Lions can finally experience a season where the roster remains largely intact when the biggest games arrive. Think about how often injuries have become part of the story. Every season seems to reach a point where Detroit is forced to adjust because key contributors are unavailable. Coaches adapt, backup players step into larger roles. The team continues fighting, but every missing starter changes what the Lions are capable of doing on the field. That's why some fans are beginning to wonder if the organization should approach preparation differently than it did during the early years of the rebuild. Dan Campbell's perspective is understandable. He wants players prepared for everything. He wants them physically ready for the demands of a full NFL season. He wants them mentally prepared to play Detroit's brand of football. That approach helped create one of the toughest teams in the league, but the reality is that today's Lions roster is different from the roster Campbell inherited. Back then, Detroit needed to establish an identity. Now Detroit needs to protect an identity. Those are two very different challenges. Another interesting development this offseason is how much roster turnover has quietly taken place. Fans naturally focus on the biggest names, but every successful organization eventually reaches a point where difficult decisions must be made. Players who helped build the foundation aren't always the same players who remain for the next chapter. The departures of veterans such as Taylor Decker, Alex Anzalone, and Khalif Raymond signal that transition. These were respected contributors who played important roles during the team's rise. Yet the Lions continue getting younger in several key areas, bringing in players who are expected to carry the organization forward. That youth movement creates both excitement and responsibility. Younger players bring energy, athleticism, and long-term potential. At the same time, they must prove they can handle the pressure that comes with competing for championships. Expectations are no longer about development. Expectations are about results. That is another reason why veterans such as Chuck Clark could become more important than many fans realize. Experience matters, depth matters, leadership matters. Over the course of a long season, those factors often become just as valuable as raw talent. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of the entire situation. The Lions don't appear to have a talent problem. They don't appear to have a motivation problem. They don't appear to have a culture problem. What they need more than anything is availability. If Detroit can keep its core players on the field, there is every reason to believe this team can compete with anyone. The foundation exists, the coaching staff exists, the star power exists, the opportunity exists. Everything now comes down to turning potential into results over the course of a full season. That is why Dan Campbell's comments generated so much discussion. They reopened a debate that many fans thought had already been settled. Is the aggressive approach still the best path forward? Or has the roster reached a point where preserving health should become the primary focus? The answer won't come during June or July. The answer will come months from now, when the regular season begins, when injuries start affecting rosters across the league, and when Detroit tries to prove that this talented group can finally stay together long enough to accomplish everything it is capable of achieving. The Lions have built something special. The talent is undeniable. The expectations are enormous. And now the biggest challenge may not be building a contender anymore. It may simply be keeping that contender healthy long enough to reach its ultimate goal. One final aspect of this entire discussion that shouldn't be overlooked is how quickly perceptions can change in the NFL. Right now, most Lions fans look at the roster and see one of the strongest groups Detroit has assembled in years. The confidence is understandable, the offensive core is established, the defensive foundation is in place, the coaching staff has earned trust. On paper, this team has everything necessary to make another serious run, but the NFL rarely follows the script. That is exactly why the conversation surrounding training camp intensity feels more important than it might have a few years ago. Every decision is now viewed through the lens of championship expectations. When Dan Campbell first arrived, the focus was on changing habits. The Lions needed players who could handle adversity. They needed competitors willing to embrace difficult practices and difficult situations. The physical culture became a defining characteristic of the organization. Today, however, the roster is filled with players who already understand those expectations. The leadership is established. The standards are established. The locker room culture is established. Nobody is questioning whether the Lions are mentally tough enough to compete. Instead, the focus shifts towards sustainability. Can the Lions maintain their edge while also reducing unnecessary risks? Can they preserve the physical identity that made them successful without placing excessive strain on key contributors? Can they find the balance between preparation and preservation? Those questions may end up defining the upcoming season more than many fans realize. The encouraging part is that Detroit appears to have options. The roster depth is stronger than it has been in previous years. Younger players are stepping into larger roles. Veterans remain available to provide stability. The organization has spent years building this foundation, and now it has reached the point where competition exists across multiple